Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, I think. Let me just double check. I think we're live now. Yes, we are. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can. All good.
Yes. Welcome everybody. My name is Ali Gomabe. I'm with the Human Rights Solidarity Movement Africa for Palestine. Today in our webinar series, we are joined by Comrade Irfaan Mangera from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. She's responsible for youth development and a number of technical issues related to youth development at the foundation. Good afternoon, Mr. Mangera.
Good afternoon, Comrade Ali. So good to be on this platform speaking with you once more. It's been a while.
It's been a while. For those who don't know, South Africa, especially Johannesburg side, has been extremely cold. It's below 0, right?
Yeah, it last night was actually -6 or something, -7.
Yeah, it's been very cold this side.
Yeah.
Yes, before we begin, for those who don't know, Africa for Palestine is an African-based organization that is primarily concerned with solidarity with Palestinians. What we do is we run campaigns. Part of those campaigns that we run is to spread awareness across the continent and to stop the spread of the Israeli propaganda inside the continent. We work with many different organizations that identify with our cause: churches, mosques, trade unions, political movements, the broader civil society, governments across the continent. So we are having a webinar series we started last month. And if you can see on our videos in our gallery, we did other webinars as well. Today, our webinar is on building grassroots movement and the youth. And we have with us Comrade Irfaan Mangera, who, like I said, is from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and deals with youth development aside. Before we jump into it, Comrade Irfaan, just shortly tell us about yourself. A person doesn't know you, how will they get to know who you are?
Okay. Yeah, it's always difficult answering this question, because you need to now reflect, who am I what do I stand for? Who am I? And I think at a basic level, so yeah, wait, you've covered my name, Irfaan, my surname Mangera. I'm a community activist. I've also come through a lot of student organizations, student activism as well. I started off quite young in, more volunteering kind of initiatives at your local context. So, with orphanages and the old age home, and then gradually becoming more aware of social issues. And I think just going through that process, I'd say I'm an activist by nature, and I am a person who likes to serve people, and by service I mean help themselves in a way. So I think I don't want to go too far into this, because I'm a person who can also just speak on and on. But at a basic level, yes, I'm a community and student activist. And yes, you're absolutely correct. I do work for the Kathrada Foundation in the youth development program. But aside from that, I'm also involved actively and sort of at just on a part-time volunteer basis in other organizations as well.
All right. So basically, Irfaan is an activist.
That's correct.
That description.
That's the easiest and simplest way to define me, or yeah, I would say.
Right. Comrade Irfaan, within the context of youth development, can you just please tell us what does it entail, besides from your job, but also your understanding of youth development in terms of activism and grassroots movement building?
So, I think for me, let me link first myself and then go into the broader idea and concepts. And I think So young people are the backbone of society in a way, because you are the future, but you're also the present, because now you need to be able to be equipped with the necessary tools to take forward your livelihoods and also that of your communities as well. So youth development for me was looking back and saying, okay, how have I developed over time? And by doing so, it meant the skills I learned, the education I received, the people I engaged with, and what did that mean for me as a person, for my personal growth and my personal development. And it ranged from, you know, soft skills around organizing to my formal education, in the sense of my schooling career, and then for my tertiary education, and how that then impacts on our daily life, and how that causes a ripple effect for others, your community, your society, your country, and so on. So within the context of what I do, youth development is, for me, focused on how do we get young people to become resilient? How do we get young people to take on challenges that exist and equip them with the necessary skills and tools in order to respond to those challenges? With our context, so the foundation has youth clubs. Youth clubs um, are youth activist based, so they're meant to create a formation and an organization of young people in order to take forward some form of activism within their communities. And I think this is where I draw a linkage, is that the community and youth development go hand in hand, because, you know, for too long we've only seen we've only looked at the idea that youth development is just this one linear process, not realizing that, you know, if you're not getting this right, communities are also not benefiting, because there's no opportunities for those young people, or there's no spaces where these young people can enter and develop their full potential. And that's why there's multi dimensions to it, because your your community has to be your first space in which your young people can access an opportunity, whether it's economically, socially, in any form. And in order for us to develop the youth, the community needs to be a space that is supportive of that growth and that process. So it means, um, are we creating the necessary programs for skills? Do young people, what sort of education are they receiving? And if so, should that change, and should that not change? And again, bringing it back. So our youth clubs then are run through a training program that says, okay, you are interested in creating some form of change. We want to assist you in that change. And by doing so, we need to firstly identify what is it that you need. So organizing skills require, you know, it could be basic stuff like how to manage finances, how to um, understand yourself as a civic, as part of civil society, because now it's a civic education. So do you understand the role of government? How can you access government and support services? How do you build power? How do you build a collective, a collective in the sense of organization? Because too often we work in these little vacuums, or in these smaller spaces, not realizing that youth development is not just a singular thing. In as much as you it's a, you know, person by person, because everybody needs to get those skills and education and so on. It's also how you build a collective of young people, so that together they can also enable a much larger change. So I do hope that I'm not that I'm making sense as well for you, Comrade Ali, and the listeners.
Yeah. Look, for me as a young person as well, and I think many people across the world will also concur that in many instances, um, the youth and young people are spoken for, and they don't speak themselves because they are not in positions to make those particular, I say, demands. So for a particular example, the government will say, for the youth to develop, we are going to do 1, 2, 3, but
Yeah.
that is outside of what the youth would want at the particular time, you know. And so it's interesting that you talk about opportunities for the youth in that particular communities. And I think that's very important. So for the youth to speak their language, to make their own demands, and to be comfortable with who they are and the role they want to play in society. So it's very interesting. Also, you were involved in student politics. I know that you were involved in campus politics. You were involved in the Muslim Student Association. You're part of the executive leadership of it. So tell us, how does that translate to the community? Because in most instances, and I think we must be honest enough that it's privileged in South Africa to be in an institutional hiring to begin with. So how do we take that activism on campus, which has a lot of privilege also, and translate it to our communities? The Rose Must Fall movement we saw that started in UCT, the Peace Must Fall that spread all over the country. How do we take that particular kind of activism, vibrant, very ideologically driven, into our communities?
Yeah. So I think there's a huge link, and I'll get to some of the maybe touch on some of the historical context that I often reflect on. But firstly, I agree, you know, that opportunity, you know, we being spoken to and we being spoken for, rather than, you know, creating the spaces where it's us as young people who are leading the change. And I think from that aspect, young people are always told you are the leaders of tomorrow, and you are, you know, bringing world, come into the spaces tomorrow rather than today. And I think in all, you know, situations, young people around the world are saying, but we're suffering now, but we don't have employment, we don't have opportunities, we continue living in this anguish, and it's becoming a real problem. And I think that's where you've also seen a lot of monumental shifts when it comes to power dynamics, where young people start organizing. And for me, grassroots organizing then entails us doing so. But we'll get to that a bit later in this discussion. I think looking at what you're saying around student activism, for me, it was really important that I went through that process, because at my first year in university, Fees Must Fall actually started. That's when the movement began, and there was lots of discussions, and it became quite massive at the time. And for a young boy, particularly from with my background, who schooled in an all Muslim school, who comes from a community that was part of the Group Areas Act, so you know it's predominantly a particular race, a particular racial group, or particular color, religion, and so on. For me, it was an awakening. Not as big, because thankfully I had the experience of volunteering and being part of sporting and community initiatives before that. So my interactions were not as the same as my schoolmates. But getting to campus and then realizing that it's like an awakening, because you are now exposed to people from all walks of life. You're exposed to these massive concepts and issues that you now need to start grappling with. And you know, at the time, it was Comrade Shaira and many others who were part of the WITS SRC, who I learned from personally. And I think for that kind of movement building, for me, gave me that political consciousness that I didn't necessarily have prior to a university. You'd understand, you'd see things on the news, you'd read a few articles, but that would be it. So that spurred me on into a more critical awareness and critical awakening around actual much deeper issues and structural issues. And for me, then it was a question of, okay, how do I, like, this is here at campus, and it's, student issues. We're fighting for the issue of fees. Rose Must Fall has happened as well. So, it's questioning issues around racism and, the colonialism and its manifestations and forms. And getting into those debates allowed me to then process and see how I link that to my community, because now none of that was happening. None of those discussions were happening here on the ground. And I was in the Kathrada Foundation youth program just prior to getting to campus. It was just the previous year that I completed that. And thankfully, we got to engage on some of that with Uncle Kathy, who was still alive back then. And, it just, how then do we link this up? Because many of the activists then who were part of, say, local organizing in the 70s and 80s in Lens weren't exactly who went on, because now they were not young anymore. And during the 70s and 80s, they organized so well and effectively that they were one of the most effective groupings of young people here, or I'd say in the country or in the region even. And for me, then it was saying, okay, how do we look at what's going on? Because there were certain trends. So you had students at that time who were in university at Wits, for example. You had people like Ismail Akowaya and others who were leading and part of student formations back then. And they were the ones coming back to the community, organizing not just with students from university, but with other youth in the community who didn't have that privilege to access university, who didn't have those opportunities to access university. And they were able to bring in, a lot of that reading material, a lot of those ideas, and it translated into a body of youth who are then able to still grapple regardless of whether you're at university or not. And the impact of that allowed for people to grapple with bigger concepts and ideas and readings on Marx and so on, and then use that to organize in their community, which became a really, really solid grounding and a solid foundation. So I think for me, translating that student activism has to have a community element. And I think we're not getting enough of that, where students at university level not necessarily going back into their communities and translating that into youth organizing in those areas that they come from. I'm not saying all, because I've found, in my experience, I've found a number of young people who do that and who've started initiatives around tutoring, around helping out at advice offices, launching their own NGOs. So it does translate in a way, but I think to be effective, there needs to be sort of a linkage between all these little groupings so that we can see, for movement building, you need to have that linkage. You need to have that network of young people where, regardless of which community we can call you and we can say, this is what's happening. Can you join? Do you want to join this campaign? And so on. So I'll leave that there.
Interesting that you bring up the kind of skills that people learn in university education they get to bring it back to their community. Steve Biko, back in his time, they would have clinics, because during apartheid the healthcare system did not adequately provide for Black people, so they would have clinics in their villages and so on to help out in the community. So I think it's important that those who go to universities get education, can bring it back. And I think for many young people out there, the Fees Must Fall campaign, the Rose Must Fall campaign, at the heart of it was conscientizing society, conscientizing students that, look, we are still in the colonized education, you need to change 1, 2, 3, and 4. And many of those who were not affected by, let's say, financial exclusions in the universities joined Fees Must Fall, joined Rose Must Fall. Those were privileged and, would say, it doesn't affect me, I got my fees paid, but they joined in because they were conscientized. So I think young people need to get back into communities, conscientize young people in their communities so that they can develop them in those particular communities. And coming to this, we know this to be truth, that there is some element of apathy amongst the youth in South Africa, and in some extent in the world, that young people are just not interested anymore. Young people are just, don't tell me about politics, don't tell me about activism. Have you encountered that?
So I have encountered that, but I've also encountered the complete opposite, where you do have young people who want to create a change, who are interested, but also don't have again, those tools and the skills necessary to create those changes, or be part, or be willing to be involved. However, I do want to shed light, and I think that the apathy also doesn't just come out of nowhere. I think you have, for us currently, we've seen how trends in this democratic government continue to go on, where corruption is rampant and rife, where you have situations where young people are seeing money meant for their development and that community's development being taken elsewhere, or used up by one or two individuals who decided that they wanted that money. And I think the apathy is it's concerning in a way, because people are saying it's not going to change. It's so many years. We keep hearing the same old story. We have this commission, we'll have this inquiry, but we're not seeing like practical changes to the situation. So in a way, it also just people are like, what do you do? Like, it's just a hopeless situation. And I think the lack of enthusiasm comes out because people think that they can't make a difference to what's going on. They can't make an impact for even fighting corruption, for example, because you think you're just one small piece in this huge puzzle. And I think that's where I'd argue against, and I think it comes back to the ideas of youth development and youth organizing at a localized level, because we've seen the report of the Auditor General. We know that corruption in local municipalities is so high, but how do we address those things? How do we say, as young people, you can take this forward through the mechanisms that exist, but you can't do it alone. You need to build your power. Building power means you creating a force for change by getting more and more young people mobilized. And you mentioned the issue of conscientizing, and through those kind of clinics and so on, that the Black Conscious movement did well. And it's one and the same, because through that building of awareness and understanding, people then take what they know and channel it into an effective mode of activism. And apathy can be changed, because people are, or rather, let me say, my experiences with young people and going into it, particularly like townships or areas that are neglected, and you see young people on a daily sitting back and saying, what do we do? Like, we just there. So there's no schooling opportunities or educational opportunities post-schooling that they access because of the conditions that they face, largely socioeconomic conditions. And that's why when I went to this one community, I think it was early last year, and myself and my colleague were just in awe at just seeing these young people on the streets not doing anything. And this is now midweek, during the day, you're seeing, okay, but why is this the case? It should be that young people have stuff to do, that they part of the economy, or that they part of the social fabric, being productive. And it just took us aback. And then when we actually had our meeting with some of the youth there, they were like, we don't have much opportunity. We don't have the infrastructure even to host proper events or programs, because it just doesn't allow us in this space. So I think that apathy, there's many areas in which this is created and this is manifested in. But given the opportunity, I think young people will respond to it well, because it's not that we just want to be lazy. It's that young people have an interest in doing something. It's just they don't know how, and they don't know where to access some of that. And even in those accessing certain opportunities, there's huge economic conditions or economic situation that limit young people from accessing. For example, just taking a taxi from say Joburg South to Joburg City Center costs some money. And if you are unemployed for so many years, getting that money alone is a lot to ask for. So we have to then critique those situations. And I think it comes back to the idea of the way society is structured, the way haven't responded well to the socioeconomic conditions in the last I think 10, 20 years. Yeah.
There's a famous African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child. The opposite is true. It takes a village to break the child, I think. And it's our communities that contribute to conscientizing our youth. I think also the opposite is true when it comes to apathy as well. Well, most of social justice movements in the favelas in Brazil, the Great Return marches in Gaza, the Black Lives Matter, the Fees Must Fall that we spoke about, the Rose Must Fall that we spoke about, were led by the youth in the main. So we are seeing a generation of youth that are tired, the youth that are saying, no, we've been waiting, now we're going to take it to the streets, now we're going to do something about it. The yellow vest in France. So globally, young people are standing up, and young people are getting fed up. Do you think we are bringing the sexy back in activism? Are we making it attractive to the young millennia? Also speaking as someone who is skilled in education for young people.
In a way, I probably could say yes, but I think it's that issue of, again, being so tired that you live and exist in a world that's constantly killing itself. You can speak on these, you've mentioned so many, and I think one of the biggest issues around youth mobilization and youth movements around the world, again, is your climate justice movement. And that alone, being led by such young people, like school-going young people, was the most eye-opening thing for me in the last few years, aside from the other ones you mentioned, because there you have it's a lot more like the youth in the 20s or the student years. But I think that idea of sexiness maybe is just the aesthetic, but young people are tired that you live in a world that's constantly killing itself. And the climate issue is one that just gives us that that underpinning, because we're not doing enough to protect our environment, and not protecting our environment means we just basically wanting to kill ourselves. But then there's also the idea that young people are aware of things a lot more than in the past. And you have the age of social media where people can share things. They can, it's sometimes an ego boost. It's sometimes a place where we can engage critically on things. And that sexiness or that appeal to young, especially millennials, is to say we need a different world. We need to reimagine something different, away from the norm, because people say the same things, they do the same things, and nothing is changing. And for a person like me and others in the youth activism space, it's reimagining it doesn't just mean I'm gonna stay up at night thinking about it. It means what message do I send to other young people who look at me and who I look at in a sort of a collective view and collective understanding of where we are at currently. Because we have to take stock. We take stock of our current conditions and say, this isn't working anymore. The norm doesn't exist. We shouldn't be accepting it as a norm. It shouldn't be normal that young people are being raped and killed on a daily. It shouldn't be a norm that women are abused and domestic violence is instead of decreasing, it's in fact increasing more and more as we go through our lives. And at this point, it's just exhausting that you have to continuously hear and say the same things. And I think it's not the attractiveness, but it's just that young people are also just angry and upset and sad that we've allowed, or the previous generations have allowed us to get to a point like this where we only see doom and gloom rather than hope and trying to create a new environment for us to live and exist in. For me, there was a discussion I had with a friend, and he was like, we reached 25, it's a midlife, it's our midlife crisis now. That's it. And for just to understand that, it's like young people are like saying that we don't even think we'd live till 50, because of the situation around the world. And it's to say, I think it's that the practical element, your living conditions, your day-to-day existence, that just pushes you to say, no, we can't keep being quiet. We have to find our voice and we have to do something about it. And we can make it look sexy for some, but it's also more than sexiness. It's about being able to be part of something that says we no longer want to just conform and adopt the ways of the past.
Yeah, I agree with you fundamentally. History is the best teacher, and during our own struggle against apartheid, the generation of Nelson Mandela, Ahmed Kathrada, that they were young at the time, and they said to the current leadership of the ANC that, hey guys, look, we agree with you, apartheid must fall, but it needs to be a little bit quicker. You must reimagine the way you campaign. You must change the way we defy the apartheid government. I think it's important for the young, for the youth to put in a voice that, of course, social justice is what we all strive for, but let's try to change the way we do it. Let's get it there faster. The Me Too movement was an example of it. But of course, we were all speaking against women abuse and the predatory nature of men, but they came with a different way of doing it. It worked. So I think it's important for the youth to bring in something different. We're not invalidating what the current generation or the past generation did. We are adding more into it, and bringing it a bit closer to home. You went to Palestine a couple of years ago. So just tell us your experience there, and then before we delve into it.
Sure. This one was always an emotional experience for me. So prior to that, I was doing some work in the Palestinian solidarity movement, and this opportunity came about where the Palestinians were hosting this youth conference, and it was an international youth conference, and I think there was about 4 or 5 of us who were invited to then go. And I think there was a lot of nerves. Let me start there. There was a lot of nerves and excitement before going in. Some of us were worried that we were already so involved that you might not be allowed in because these are some of the stories that we've heard. And, so much so that from the 4 of us who actually left to go, 2 of our young people who were part of our delegation from South Africa were sent back from the airport, who were kept there in interrogation for hours and hours, who, these interrogation techniques, it was also during winter in Palestine, so being kept in the cold of the cells and then still, only afterwards being then deported back to I'm not sure if that's the right word, back to South Africa. And that already it came at a shock to us. So myself and my comrade Magan, Karishma, we got in. So the only 2 of us made it there from South Africa. And the initial experience alone was just so shocking that what came afterwards, either had to maintain that kind of experience, or it had to give us something new to experience or think about. And hearing back from the comrades who got deported, it was just it was just an emotional ride because we got in and they didn't. We were also worried because for hours and hours we didn't know how they were doing or whether or not they were in interrogate. We didn't know what was happening. So I think that already gave us so much to think about around how the apartheid state of Israel treats people, and not even it's treating of young people who are not who are not there to threaten anyone, in the sense of we're not terrorists. We are not. We're just there to understand, to seek justice, and having that experience just tells us enough about how they treat people who oppose their apartheid system. And then going into Palestine itself, this conference allowed us to meet young people from around the world. Some were Palestinians who had to leave home. Their grandparents had to leave. So they were Palestinian refugees in other countries from like South America, parts of Europe. And they also shared their stories, which also gave us insight into how different the dynamics are from them who are living life in another country as refugees versus those Palestinians currently in the country who are experiencing, the daily onslaught and the daily oppression by the Israelis. And that experience, I think, shifted a lot of my thinking around activism around Palestine and the whole Palestinian issue, because I think building the movement and being part of the Palestinian solidarity movement then meant, how do we relay these stories to people in a way that makes them see how similar, and even as some of our South African counter leaders before have said, it's far worse than what we went through as South Africa. So how do we then take that experiences that we had into the solidarity movement? And the fact that I could link up with Palestinians who could tell me the stories, who when driving there, just seeing these apartheid walls up all over. And we actually also had a point, had to turn around from certain roads because we were not permitted to use them. And this is in Palestine. This is in Palestinian land. It's in the West Bank. It's where people loved their lives, but because of the settlers, because of the settler colonial project, people had to use alternative routes now to get from one place to the other. Instead of just a 5-minute drive, it became 2 hours and so on. And it was actually quite astonishing that you see these Israeli soldiers fully armed, fully dressed to antagonize Palestinians on a daily. And one of the experiences, I think I think it was in Jerusalem, was where these all over the city, you have them fully armed with their barricades, ready to just move, ready to just act. And it's intimidating. And I couldn't even imagine what it was like for Palestinians themselves to have to go through this on a daily. And it gave some of the reflections of us in South Africa during our state of emergency and so on. And having, I think today is just a month ago we commemorated Youth Day, and thinking of Hector Peterson and the like, who also had to face the oppression by our apartheid government. And drawing those linkages made me think about, how do we then change this existence, this life for them? And I came back, and I think I still did quite a bit of work with the solidarity movement. And I often communicate and still interact with some of the Palestinian friends that I have there, because it just is a constant reminder of how we need to do more. We need to be able to champion the struggle in a much more dynamic way, so that those, especially the young people, that don't have to live within that oppressive state any longer, and that hopefully in our lifetime we can make the change, and that Palestine will be free. So I'll just leave that experience there.
It's interesting that you say that those that fought apartheid in South Africa had the opportunity to go to Palestine, like Khalmi Motlanthe, Balagambete, actually say apartheid is a playground compared to what's happening in Palestine. I think just a few days back, there were Palestinians whose homes were demolished So because of they must get permits to build structures on their own land. When they build, they build on top of the existing houses. And they had to demolish the structure that was built on top of their household home. And in Palestine, when a bulldozer comes, the Palestinians pay for the bulldozer. So it's so horrific that the Palestinians themselves have to demolish the same structures they built. Because if the bulldozers come, they get to pay for it. Apartheid is far, far much worse in Palestine.
You know, I can add on to that because one of our experiences was visiting a refugee camp, and for us, it's so strange because now a refugee camp here on their own land that's now demarcated just for them, who are moved out from areas where the settler colonialists basically stole their land. And now the refugee camp, for what, we took a walk through, we met a few people, we spoke, we engaged. And if you see, bullet holes, you see that people can't actually build. There's a certain height that you can go up to within that refugee camp. That's regulation, so to speak, and you can't build higher than that. And for us, there was like, okay, so you can't expand it now wide. You can't go further because that you only allocated this piece, and you can't go on top. So where do people then stay? Because there's no more building that can happen. It's just now people, they exist, and the more people that come, they just have to make a plan and stay. And that was just one of the horrific experiences, because you also have the these checkpoints and the military and the armaments constantly all over the place. And even in many, like you mentioned, many of the towns and villages that were destroyed, and we actually also got to go past some of them and see how they've built these colonies, they've built these it is so traumatic, because in each of these areas that they built, well, this is now the Israeli settlers, they have these symbols, like a lion, like those wolves, that symbolism of control, of dominance, that we are the ones in charge here. And that was again an expression of how little they care about Palestinian life, of how they just want to maintain this domination over the Palestinians. And just on a daily and on a weekly, you see constant reminders of the daily life of Palestinians, where a young child was shot, or a student at university was imprisoned. And when we got to one of the universities there, and I think because we're speaking about youth and student activism, let's maybe just touch on this for a bit. A lot of the students there were speaking of how people, especially in like the SRC, like we have been arrested and detained for often months on end, and sometimes without people knowing. Like they'd come, the Israeli soldiers and they would, and special forces would come at night and take them from their dorm rooms and put them in detention, and people wouldn't be able to see them. And this would be a constant at the universities, where anyone who says something against them, or who says something that they don't like, is basically a threat and is imprisoned unlawfully, because these are not these are not in accordance with international law. And again, experiences of young people who are imprisoned and jailed as young as 13, 14, 15. And you think, what kind of a society is that imprisons and detains young people, who doesn't allow their families to see them? It's just the most horrific experience that anyone could ask for. And then still coming back to here, South Africans, who support the Zionist agenda, it just hurts a lot more, because you think our own experience should be enough to tell you that this isn't okay. This is oppression at the highest order. And no South African should be able to relay their solidarity with Zionism or Zionists, because that's just it's just the most bizarre thing and the most painful thing for that I had to experience coming back as well.
So, look, I think for those who our international audience want what the Israeli lobby in this country fails to understand is how South Africa is diverse as it is. We have 11 official languages, different ethnic groups, white people, Asians, Indians like Irfaan, black people, African like myself. And the movement has been growing in that regard. It's diverse. We have all these groups of people from different walks of life, different religions, and all of them put together in this pool of fighting for Palestine solidarity movement. And people have been very amazed. White Zionists in particular, like, oh, you're black, you're African. What do you know about Palestine? Have you ever been to Palestine? They lack to, they don't understand it. And I think it's a very important kind of like uniqueness in South Africa that comes into solidarity. And I'm starting to see remnants of it in the United States as well, the Black Lives Matter movement, Jewish Voices for Peace. So you have all these different groups of people coming together for one cause. So I would ask you, what message would you have of Palestinians, particularly in Palestine, that the movement is not for a particular people? Their cause is our cause, it's everybody's cause. Everybody from all different walks of life is in solidarity with it.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think to Palestinians themselves, it's something that is their daily life is a constant reminder of how we need to be doing more. So I think that there's a huge how do I put this? So intersectionality and how we build the intersectionality between our struggles. Like you mentioned, Black Lives Matter. In South Africa, the progressive movements here as well, whether it's fighting against inequality or whether it's fighting against racism here in South Africa, in the UK, in parts of India, in South America, you gave the issue of you gave the example of in the favelas in South America. I think that with where the world is currently, the global shift and power dynamics between your right and your left, you have the racists who have taken over governments now, using the law, obviously, but because they embody those ideals and those principles that are very exclusionary, that are based on hatred, they are based on division of people, that are not understanding or not valuing of human life. And just I think it was last week where the Kathrada Foundation was part of a global panel of academics and activists and people from across the globe speaking about how we will rise through we continue to rise, but how do we build solidarity between movements and anti-racist movements in particular? And I think the Palestinian cause is for me at the center of this, because for years and years and years, this has been the cause that has showed or set aside people's views and understanding of what how bad institutionalized racism and the settler colonial project can become, where millions of Palestinians are displaced and continue to be displaced, where people are on a daily threatened with their lives being taken from them. I think that message to young people is to continue recognizing that our struggles are all linked. Our struggles aren't just one and there's another one there, and there's another one there. There's always a link between each of these struggles. And within that linkage, we need to define and understand what is it that we need to be doing to build solidarity, and what does solidarity look like and feel like. And is it just being active on social media? Is it just sharing those words on social media to enhance the voice and awareness of it? Or are we moving towards a more practical age of our solidarity efforts, where we're not seeing enhancing, or we're not actively pursuing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement? And this is across the globe, because if you can say in America with the BLM movement, who are those organizations that support this kind of anti-Black or anti-people of color, as they call it, kind of repression? And in South Africa, who are the people involved in carrying out this kind of oppressive nature, or oppressive tactics against the poor and marginalized communities, and so on? In each country, you critically analyze what is happening, how do we tackle those issues. And for me, it draws back again to the grassroots level activism. Just last night, as I was scrolling through Twitter, I saw a lot of people speaking about how Google removed Palestine from the map, and a lot of young people were posting about this. And it's always this thing of why Palestine is now being taken through this, but when Black Lives Matter was that you were all vocal. And it's not this whataboutism. We need to move away from this kind of thinking. These struggles are all connected. These struggles mean that in Palestine, the oppression there is also linked to the oppression that people are feeling elsewhere. But it doesn't mean that we need to degrade or take away from one and put forward the other. They all should be looked at within the same lens. And again, that social media activism is only good if it's complemented by more practical elements. And you could be doing this in many ways and forms as young people. And I think especially those that have skills, because since BLM has exploded again this year, you've seen such great and phenomenal content around materials that can be used for teaching and training young people, or not just even young people, but anyone. I've been looking through Instagram, and you have these posts that show, how to know, or how to build anti-racism at a school, for example, or tackling anti-racism in this community or in that community. And these are resources that young people are designing themselves, are thinking about, that are engaging in academic material, but also in fusing that with or bringing it into simplifying it so that people on the ground can understand. And you might not have a design skill, but you might have say an accounting skill. You're an accountant and you have some time. Your activism could be assisting these organizations, because there's always a need, especially in civil society, with NGOs who are doing some of the work, to aid them and to assist them in doing so. And I think it's just that we need to recognize where can we best fit in. And you can pick that struggle and fight it, and still lend and share your solidarity with others around the world. You don't necessarily have to be 24/7 on the ground at this protest, and then the next day at that protest, and the next day at that protest. You can also pick your struggle, but link your struggle to the others as well, and don't close off, or don't work within a vacuum. Work within a way that extends your expertise and extends your ideas to others across the globe. And because we live in this era where we have access to technology and social media, we can share those things much faster. We can share those ideas, those resources much faster. And the internet is so great that you can spend 2 hours on there just gaining and getting resources. You can also sign up these tremendous causes around how you can be a much more effective activist. From our side, we'll be doing a lot of sort of grassroots work and launching more clubs this year, hopefully. And in that process, we're hoping that at a community level, we start building consciousness of young people. We start taking these issues to the ground where people understand those linkages and can make a change from then onwards. So Comrade Ali, I can speak a lot more. I can speak for days. Sometimes it's often not understood. Sometimes it is understood. But yeah, I think I'd leave it there. I just do want to, I earlier on in the conversation, I mentioned that it was Ismail Akelwaya, but I actually meant Yusuf Akelwaya, who was part of the MK unit under Comrade Isu Chiba. And he was the student activist who was linking around, who was at Wits University, who was a student leader and so on. And amongst others, they would come back to the community and share their expertise and knowledge and build grassroots movements. So yeah, I just wanted to make that correction as well.
All right. Yeah, we can go on and on and on. But in closing, Comrade Irfaan, we've seen a resurgence of youth movements in the continent, the collapse of the dictatorship in Sudan, the scourge of violence against women in South Africa. We have young people fighting against the civil war in Eritrea. And you have a lot of young people in Palestine, in the Great Return March, young people in South America and so on. So there's this surge of young people standing up saying, you know what, it's time for us to take action. So what would you say to those youth, particularly those in Palestine, organizing the Great Return March, organizing demonstrations in Tel Aviv, in occupied West Bank, in Gaza?
I think at a basic level, just keep up the fight. Their actions inspire more action. You know, you mentioned Sudan, and I think, let me just put it out there. Last year, Comrade Ala Saleh was here, who's one of the young people who was part of those, part of the protest in Sudan last year or the year before. And just being there, or just having a year, inspired so many of our young people, even though there was a language barrier. And I think all these young people across the globe who are standing up for justice, who are standing up for their rights, and who are standing up for change, are inspiring more and more people across the globe. And I personally get in, you know, just seeing them and just engaging with them, find so much hope, that we will overcome this as young people. We will be able to recreate or reimagine this world and rebuild this world so that it serves all of us and not just some of us. And the idea that, you know, there can be no justice, or there can be no peace without justice. And I think their actions and their campaigns and all the work that they are doing continues to translate across the globe, especially with those people who are also oppressed and part of marginalized communities. And I think it's just to say, continue, a luta continua. We are with you in solidarity. We are with you all the way. And we continue to build on in these solidarity movements, and hope that all our actions will result in a far better world where all people live in freedom, with all their rights protected as well.
Thank you, Comrade Irfaan. Thank you so much. Thank you for your input. Thank you for your advice. Thank you for your words. We appreciate it. Till next time.
Thanks, Comrade Ali, and thanks to all the listeners. I do hope it was a really fruitful webinar, and a luta continua. We have to keep on the struggle, and may our actions result in freedom for the Palestinians, but for all people across the globe who are facing oppression. Thank you so much.
Sure.